Danny doesn't have the stats, the counterplan is conditional, you can kick it, I'm not going for it. Now go to the disad. First, Danny is missing the entire idea of the framing of the disad. The idea of the disad is that you wanted these states to maintain control. So his arguments, all of the terms that he's reading from the bond evidence don't matter because it's not about the government losing control, because the government would still be maintaining control even if it's through military intervention. But I'll do the specific line by line. First extent, the Bodea 12 evidence that there is stability in Africa because of the resources and how it's maintaining stability. You prefer my evidence because it's a study that goes over the 10 years of Africa and how it's maintained stability. And as these countries become resource rich, they become more stable. So it also proves a direct causal link in terms of stability. He does not cite any evidence. He just talks about how there is some instability here and there, but he doesn't even read evidence. That's a wishy-washy claim. There's no way that you're voting off it. But second, the evidence cites how there's lower amounts of war in these countries and how there's lower civil war because these countries are engaging in resource extraction and because they have the stability of the rents that they're engaging in. The evidence is very good on this question. There's no way that you're buying into it. And the second argument that he makes is the Bodea 12 evidence, but he's missing the entirety of the framing because it's fine if the government is using violence. This might seem like a counterintuitive claim to you, but the thesis of the disad is that as long as these governments are maintaining control, even if they're an oppressive government, the fact that they have control prevents against extinction through these nuclear wars that would be inevitable to control. So all the arguments that he's reading are basically turns against him. They all bolster the disad because the government would be using this military intervention or to engage in the violence to maintain their strength right now, which means that his evidence is simply not responsive and it bolsters the disad. Now he says that we would use the military to fight each other, and to fuel the groups to fight each other. But first, this is just not true because the government would be the one that's controlling the resources. The rebel groups would not have the resources and they would not have the military weapons in order to fight against it. And second, he's also not reading evidence on this question. He's just making analytical warrants and making up arguments as to why this would be true. So you can extend the Bodea 12 evidence, which is the only evidence on this question that natural resource wealth is key to maintaining government stability because these governments are in a kind of tenuous situation, but their resource wealth is key to allowing them to have enough wealth and enough stability so that they can maintain the institutions and the weapons that he is talking about in order to be able to go out and prevent these civil wars from occurring, which is why his bond evidence is key negative evidence. Now, the Blitz 7 evidence says that these wars will go global. If you have these civil wars and they're rebelling against the government, now he says that there's simply a risk on it, and I would have to have a complete collapse, but that's not true because as long as there is a sufficient amount of civil war and as long as there's a sufficient amount of instability that is being caused by these internal revolutionary groups, these other countries will be drawn in, such as the United States and China, because they all have vested interests in these countries, which is a reason that his claim simply does not matter. I wouldn't have to access 100% brink of it to happen, but we are close enough to the brink, as the Bodea 12 evidence indicates, that we would be able to go global, and the Douche 2 evidence indicates that if we go, and that these wars would be likely to go nuclear, that would cause extinction. Now, this is the most probable extinction scenario in this debate round because the idea of the nuclear weapons would involve all of these countries going in, and they would all create this nuclear war as opposed to the marginal developing countries that he talks about, but we'll do the way in between the scenarios there on the app, so go there now. The problem with the affirmative strategy on this is that he's conceding multiple turns and saying that they only matter under his framework, but that's simply not true because the way that he's extending his advantage is that the thing that matters is that the North is depleting the South, which is all a version of the imperialist impact that he's talking about. So when he just says that all my imperialist impacts only matter under his framework, that is simply not true because the internal link to the advantage, all of the tags, all of the evidence is about the imperialist North invading the South. So if I'm winning the internal links with the new evidence and the arguments about how I prevent these grassroots that I allow for these grassroots movements, or all these arguments about how I allow for the better environmental protection where these northern countries will not go into the southern countries, then I access his advantage as well. And there's no way that he's winning this debate because that is the only impact that he's winning at the end of the debate. That's the only way that he can win in this. So you can extend that the framing of the entirety of this contention is what he is doing about the northern powers. What he's doing is he's changing the way that the southern powers engage in these actions, but that doesn't mean that the northern powers have less motivation to go into these countries and have less motivation to create change. You can extend so you can extend the Liu evidence that the Liu evidence that the fact that I'm controlling that the internal link to these failed states and that there's going to be more civil wars means that it turns the entirety of the case because his case because the Liu evidence says that when we have these failed states, the United States will go in there and say that we need to have a democratic intervention where really all they wanted to have is oil, so that allows for the interventions that he's criticizing, that allows for the North to go in and create the changes that he says are going to cause this extinction scenario. That is the strongest internal link. He's not making any substantive responses to that. He just says that the domestic policies allow for that to happen, but he's not giving you a warrant for why the United States would care what the domestic policies are, because they still want to have their resources. They're going to have more motivation to go in and get these resources if he's decreasing the amount of extraction that we engage in. So his extensions make absolutely no sense. But even if you're granting him full access to the advantage, you still vote off the time frame impact. He says that it is wishy-washy and is like space and time don't really matter. But if extinction is more likely to happen before his scenario even happens, you don't vote off this scenario because these are both existential impacts. His scenario simply would not happen if the negative advantage happens first. So So as long as there's a sufficient probability or a marginal risk that it will happen before the 100 years, then you vote off of my scenario because his scenario would not even happen. Now he says that my evidence doesn't make sense because it's wishy-washy and because you have these 10 authors and you don't know who they are, but his evidence still commits these same problems because he's not reading to you every single methodological part of his study that exists. I'm citing to you 10 qualified sources, and it doesn't matter if his are scientific because it's an issue of political science versus his natural science. He's not doing comparisons of why that really matters. The only thing that matters is that my brink is more clearly, is that my brink comes earlier, even if his is clearly defined. The fact that my scenario would happen first means that it does not matter what will happen under his scenario. So, and also off the humans won't exist if they survive extinction. The way that it's framed is off of the north extraction from the south. So here's the framing issue in this round. You're granting the access to the disad, which is sufficient to outweigh the app. But even if you're buying into the app, the terms that's being conceded off of view 05 means that it's sufficient for you to vote negative off of that because the disad turns case.
Okay. I had, there's like one.
I wrote it down.